Good evening. This is Broadcasting ADHD Europe. I'm Hans van der Velde, and tonight we're talking about ADHD at work. In daily life, I work as a coach. I coach employee for employers, so this will be very interesting. But today we will be talking about ADHD at work with Dora Weinschenk, who will introduce herself in a minute. And first I go to Viljo. Viljo is our assistant. Please introduce yourself, Viljo.
Hello, my name is Viljo Wilding. I'm the tech lead at Addis and a board member of ADHD Europe. So I will be running the webinar behind the scenes, making sure that your comments and your questions get to Hans and Dora, and making sure that everything runs smoothly. So if you have any issues, technical or otherwise, put them in the comments and we will make sure that that gets seen.
Yeah, thank you, Viljo. And I'm very glad today that we talk to a psychiatrist who also has attention for the workplace, because that's not always the case. And it's a fantastic subject because work is 8 hours a day during weekdays. So it's an important thing in people's life. And can you first introduce yourself, Dora, please?
Sure. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Viljo. My name is Dora Weinschenk. I'm a psychiatrist, originally from South Africa. You might hear from my accent, but I've been living in the Netherlands for the last 6 years. So in that country of Hans. And it's been an enormous privilege for me to live here because I've been able to do some research, and I'm now currently working in the field of adult ADHD.
Yeah, so before you start your presentation, maybe it's good to give a little sort of warning to people that you start with I hope you can start with let's say the disadvantages or the burden of ADHD at work. And after that, people, don't worry, we will come to the advantages or the qualities of ADHD or whatever you call it. So sit there and we'll come to that. And I will especially invite you to that we keep the balance between the disadvantages and the advantages. So that's a wonderful start. So Dora, if you want to go ahead, please be welcome, and let's start.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen with all of you. Good. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, check.
Great. All good. Fantastic. So I wanted to start by saying it's an enormous privilege for me to be speaking for ADHD Europe. It's an amazing organization that unites many countries in Europe, but I've looked at the list of people listening in tonight, and I can see, in fact, that ADHD Europe stretches beyond the continent of Europe. It's stretching to the other continents. Not, I believe, to Antarctica, but otherwise, I think the others are pretty well represented. So I'm delighted and honored to be speaking for ADHD Europe. I'm grateful to be sharing this platform with Hans because he has a significant background and expertise in the field of law, as well as being a coach and an expert in the field of ADHD. But also Viljo is immensely calming and creative and savvy, and he's helped us put the technical side together. So yes, tonight I'm going to be talking about ADHD at work, ADHD with quite a focus on sleep disorders, because that's where I did a lot of research. And then, of course, how these impact on work performance. And just to bear in mind that when I talk about the problems associated with ADHD, please don't forget that I'm talking about untreated ADHD. So I'll keep repeating that. Untreated ADHD confers some incredible positive aspects to people living with a condition, but it can confer some difficulties when people are in the work situation. So I have no conflicts of interest. My research was conducted with the Kenniscentrum ADHD in The Hague, together with the Free University, and I'm also working for the DIVA Foundation Just to tell you very quickly, DIVA is a diagnostic interview that was created by Sandra Coy in 2007 with some other authors. And the idea is that it's an interview to help clinicians across the world diagnose ADHD accurately. It's available in 25 languages at the moment. So my first kind of food for thought for you, my first question to you is, here are 3 terrible disasters that happened in the workplace. Chernobyl in '86, the explosion of a nuclear power station, the Challenger disaster, a space shuttle that exploded, and the Exxon Valdez oil spill, also in the 80s. So if you look at my image here, the question I want you to keep in your mind is, what do these disasters have in common? What is in common with them? As I go through my slides, think about it and we'll come back to the question. So just to tell you a little bit about Exxon Valdez, it was when a super tanker ran aground in Alaska and it spilled 258,000 barrels of crude oil. It was a terrible ecological disaster. At the time, the 3rd mate was sleeping on the job. He'd had 1 nap in the last 16 hours, so he'd been working consistently. And to load this oil onto the ship, the crew had had a shift of 22 hours, culminating in the supertanker running aground. Chernobyl has been described as the world's worst nuclear disaster. People on duty then in the power station had been working a shift of 13 hours or more. There were a series of mistakes by plant operators, and in fact, number 4 reactor was running on dangerously low power, which left it unstable, and then it exploded. When we come to Challenger, it's a very dramatic image there, but it was an explosion of a space shuttle 73 seconds into flight. All 7 crew members were killed instantly. The managers at NASA had arrived at work at 1 a.m. for the launch, and in the 24 hours leading up to the launch, they had slept for 2 hours. Now, according to a presidential commission after the explosion, the conclusion was that NASA employees had worked excessive hours, and this had worked excessive hours, jeopardizing job performance. So with these 3 disasters, what do these 3 disasters have in common? To ask you again, I don't know whether people want to perhaps post something in the chat. Hans, you can maybe chip in if there's something interesting that has come up.
So far, nobody guessed.
Nobody guessed. Okay.
No.
If you want to put your answers in the chat, we can bring them up big on the screen. So go ahead, take a couple of seconds to type something out if you have any ideas.
And do excuse my wording. I see that I jumbled up 2 words in my question.
So the first response we've got is that they were all caused by human error.
Spot on. Do we have others?
We do. A number of people have said, I'm just going to pick the first. Oh, I'm going to pick the first. That it was a lack of sleep and sleep deprivation.
Well, I can stop here because you've understood my talk. Absolutely. Is there another one, Vilja, or should I continue?
Excessive hours worked with little sleep. That's our final.
Fantastic. So absolutely, as Hans alluded to earlier, we spend up to about 1/3 of our lives asleep and 1/3 of our lives are working. Adequate sleep quantity and quality are implicated in accidents at work. For optimal occupational health, we need sleep. But good concentration is also imperative. So these had multiple factors in common, but as the first person said, human error was definitely implicated, but they also occurred between midnight and 3 a.m. and strongly linked with sleep deprivation. If you think about our biological clock, or our circadian rhythm, between midnight and 3 a.m., we are at our lowest point in terms of alertness. And coupled with poor sleep, this is a time that is ripe for errors and, unfortunately here, for disasters. So you can see that the Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred at 8 minutes past 12, Challenger at 1 in the morning, and Chernobyl began at 1:43 a.m. So what am I going to discuss with you today? You can see someone who's got insomnia. All of sheep are asleep and he's wide awake and irritable. We're going to talk about the impact of untreated ADHD at work. We're going to talk about sleep disorders and ADHD, because they're so often comorbid, and their effect on work performance. We're going to talk about another important area of untreated ADHD, which is self-regulation, the ability to control your emotional responses to things. I've slipped in some slides on women with ADHD at work, because women, unfortunately, are often neglected and sometimes have a different profile to men. And then I'm going to finish with the advantages of untreated ADHD at work. So let's talk about the impact of ADHD at work. Now, when we think about executive skills, or those brain functions that are necessary for good performance, one needs to be great at keeping time, good at organization, have a gift with problem solving, be self-motivated, and be able to sustain focus. When you have untreated ADHD, or when these executive function skills are lacking, you might arrive late, you might miss your deadlines, misplace your paperwork, lose files on your computer, have difficulty reaching your goals, and struggle to complete complex tasks with multiple steps. So no surprise, this sounds like untreated ADHD. When people have ADHD as adults and they are not treated, unfortunately, and according to research, we heard from Barbara Franke a month ago in a paper from 2016, but from other researchers, it's associated with negative outcomes. People with untreated ADHD are at a definite disadvantage. They are less likely to be employed. Here you can see that controls in the study were employed in up to about 80%, whereas people with ADHD was only about a fifth. They're more likely to lose jobs. Even if they're super bright, if their ADHD is untreated, they might have a lower occupational rank and earn less. They might end with financial problems or even with work incapacity, perhaps burnout. Hans can perhaps tell us about some of his experience with this area.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so untreated employees with ADHD often confront frustration. Their employers are disappointed in them, even if they're highly gifted and have so much to contribute. They might get low performance ratings unfairly. They might change jobs very rapidly, which isn't good for anybody's CV. They might have an increased risk of accidents and workplace injuries, and especially when coupled with sleep problems. So what predicts unemployment, according to research in people with ADHD? Well, interestingly, it's the combined presentation, so where there's hyperactivity and impulsivity as well as inattention. Also having ADD, so without the hyperactivity, and high current symptoms, which is logical. The more symptoms you have at the time that are not being treated by coaching, by therapy, or by medication, the higher chance you have to be unemployed. If you have many comorbidities like substance abuse, you're more likely to be unemployed. Also anxiety disorders, depression, and as I mentioned, drugs and alcohol. It's hard to say what's chicken and what's egg here. People with ADHD might develop depression as a result of their ADHD and have problems at work, or they might have the two conditions coexisting. but it's not something that would be rare to see someone with ADHD that's untreated with a comorbidity. And if you get on top of the ADHD and you treat it, often you'll see that the other comorbid problems might dissipate, might not even need their own specific intervention.
Someone has asked how you would define untreated, by the way, Dora, just for some clarification.
Sure. Okay, that's a great question. I think treatment begins with recognizing the condition. So we have to go a few steps back. We have to say, first of all, is the person diagnosed? Has the person been adequately evaluated? Are any coexisting problems taken into account? So if someone has a severe drug abuse problem and only the ADHD is recognized and then treated, you're going to miss the boat. So all the comorbidities like sleep problems, substance abuse, possibly anxiety, need to be taken into account and carefully assessed. And the next step, once you know what is happening in the picture, one would present to the patient or to the person a holistic package of interventions, which would include coaching, because here the person would learn skills and techniques to be functional and well with the ADHD, possibly medication, and also interventions or treatments for any other coexisting conditions. But Hans, what would you say about undiagnosed? Would you say it's someone who, hasn't got as far as getting coaching? Would you see that as an important part of treatment?
Well, first of all, I do meet people when they are 30 years old, 40 years old, and do not know they have ADHD, so really undiagnosed. And the first damage they will experience is that their self-image, their insecurity will rise, their self-image will be more and more hurt or be more bad. On the other hand, what you're saying about treated, in my company, most of the time our sort of guideline is it's best to do first diagnose, then look into medication. Most of the cases, medication is the best start after diagnosis. And then the therapy, the coaching, etc. does work better. Of course, there are exceptions, people who do it without medication, of course, but the guideline is diagnosis to be sure what kind of comorbidities there are, and start with medication, and then the coaching and the therapy and working on your self picture, etc. So that's my experience.
Thank you. So we agree, one needs to know what's happening. One needs to know the diagnosis first and then tailor the treatment to the person. But medication often gives you a platform of focus, of attention, of good time management, etc. Good executive skills to be able to take on the tool kit that you are offered by coaching.
Yep.
And exactly what Hans was saying, from this study in 2009, interestingly, people who had been treated and recognized as children with ADHD were more likely to be working in adulthood. The people who come to Hans's door in their 30s or 40s who've never had a diagnosis are probably going to be more likely to have the ramifications and the consequences of their untreated ADHD impacting on their work status. So this was a strongly predictive factor being recognized and treated in childhood. And this was independent of any other conditions or substance abuse and treatment. So my second question to you, and this is just just interesting to hear what you think as an audience, is ADHD at work considered a disability? Let's take a little bit of time just to jot a few words into the chat. And we're lucky to have Viljo and Hans with us tonight because they'll be able to give us some expertise, knowledge here.
So our first answer is that no, ADHD is not a disability.
Okay. Do we have any idea where that person lives or which country?
If you're going to put your answer in, just say where you are and why it is or isn't considered a disability. Someone has said it's not in the UK. Oh well, I have news for you there. Someone in Holland has said no. Someone else has said it's not in the US. It is in the UK. Has come up twice. Luxembourg, not for adults. So yeah, there's a mix of answers here really between people in the UK, in the US, on the continent in general.
Mm-hmm.
A very good response here from someone I've worked with closely. Beverly Nolka has said, oh, sorry, wrong person, wrong question. Beverly Nolka has said depends on the employer, which is quite a good point.
Mm-hmm. So there's some prejudice there.
So in general, I think the consensus is that for most countries, it's often not considered a disability. But in the UK, that people say that it is a disability, and not in the Netherlands. Yep.
Okay. So Hans and Viljo, maybe you can give us your opinions, and then I'll show you the bit of research that I've done. But I'd be fascinated to hear from you, from your experience and your knowledge.
Well, if you answer it formally, like, as you know, I'm legally trained. So formally, in the Netherlands and in other countries, it differs apart to situation. There are countries where it's absolutely not recognized as disability. While, for instance, in Italy, dyslexia is recognized as disability, ADHD, not yet. In the law, really, that the law says ADHD disability. That's not in Italy, in Spain, etc. It's difficult. In the Netherlands, based on anti-discrimination law, ADHD is absolutely recognized legally as a disability. On the other hand, you could also say, what's your vision? That's something else. We will come to that in the second part about the advantages of ADHD. But this is a more legal question. So disability in the Netherlands, at work, it will be recognized as a disability in the Netherlands. I know that because I work with employers and company doctors, etc. It's absolutely recognized.
Great.
And from a British perspective, from in the UK, the Equality Act 2010 and its predecessor set out what is and what isn't considered a disability. And a disability is any diagnosable condition with a effect on the person for 9 months or more. So ADHD is absolutely considered a disability. In the UK, it's illegal to discriminate against someone because of a disability, which is known as protected characteristic. And it means that employers can't not hire someone because of their ADHD, and they have to make certain reasonable adjustments to make sure that people with disabilities are able to work comfortably in their workplace and are given an equal treatment despite their different needs.
Fantastic. So you've basically taken the words out of my mouth. Just to move, so first of all, I want to mention that it's interesting that people with an interest in ADHD who have it, who live with it, or who treat it, it appears from just asking this question, might not be aware of the legal status within their own country. So we need to educate ourselves. In terms of the USA, the Americans with Disability Act considers a person to have a disability if it impacts one or major life activities, there's a record, and others perceive it to be an impairment. So it depends here in the US on the case. In some cases, ADHD would be considered a disability, and in some cases not. But people are allowed accommodations offered by employers, like quieter area of the office, being able to wear headphones at work, a taller cubicle, or even a noise cancelling machine. And as we heard from Viljo, absolutely, disability under the 2010 Equality Act, that employers actually have a responsibility to protect their employees from discrimination and harassment, and to make, as Viljo said, reasonable adjustments to assist them. So let's move on to sleep, ADHD, and work. From a multinational report from the World Health Organization, ADHD is relatively common amongst adults, is associated with high work impairment when untreated. So what role do sleep disorders play? And here we have a beautiful image of someone sleeping with a cigarette, which is perhaps not that safe. But sleep is not a safe place. Okay, Jean Cocteau, the French writer and artist, said. So what is going on with sleep and ADHD? What is chicken and what is egg? There's some people who believe that ADHD causes sleep problems. There's some people who believe that, in fact, the sleep problems themselves cause ADHD-type symptoms. There's some people who believe that there is an interaction between ADHD and sleep problems and they affect each other. There's reciprocal causation. And finally, it might be that there's a common source to the two problems. So there's a shared underlying etiology. And yes, sleep disorders coexist in up to about 80% of ADHD adults. So if you have ADHD, there's a high chance you've got a sleep problem. And there's a whole range of them: insomnia, struggling to fall asleep, short duration of sleep, being tired during the day, having a late biological clock, so feeling wide awake late at night, a delayed circadian rhythm, movement disorders like restless legs, problems breathing while you sleep, long or short sleep duration, and even falling asleep during the day, what's called narcolepsy.
By the way, I do recognize, by the way, before I started using medication, the fight against sleep in school days already, and then in work, etc. But by the way, I have some clients at the moment also with, let's say, insomnia. How are the success rates of treating insomnia? Because is it something, okay, you have to live with it, or can it be cured, let's say?
Well, there's a very effective treatment for insomnia, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy that has been developed for insomnia, CBTI. And in fact, you can even find some free guides to this on the internet. Maybe I can post this in the chat after the talk. So that's one well-recognized and successful treatment for insomnia. Insomnia is very much about struggling to rest your mind enough at night in order to be able to fall asleep. So your mind is just too busy. And often we see that with people with ADHD. They complain that they cannot switch their minds off. Their thoughts are just churning. Sometimes when you treat people with ADHD with medication, their minds come to peace, and in fact, they fall asleep more easily. So sometimes the treatment for ADHD helps with insomnia, although it's quite complicated because some of the stimulant treatments can cause insomnia too. So it depends on the case. But so the second part of the answer is that medication can be helpful for ADHD and insomnia, as well as therapy. But it can be something that is difficult to live with, for sure. And then, of course, there's the whole aspect of sleep hygiene, which are techniques that you can learn how to make it more likely that you'll have a restful night's sleep. Thanks, Hans, for that question. So let's look at poor sleep and how that can affect work. Here are 5 main factors that affect how people function at work: too little sleep, disordered sleep, disturbed daily rhythms, circadian rhythms, having a medical illness that affects your ability to sleep, or too much sleepiness during the day. And finally, 5th one is medications that affect sleep and sleepiness. So I'm going to go through these. Let's start with sleep deprivation and disordered sleep. So we know that the recommended amount of sleep for adults is between 7 and 9 hours. More than 9 hours is considered, in fact, dangerous for your health, and less than 7 hours is also just too little. Teenagers, in fact, need to sleep more than that. They need to sleep 8 to 10 hours. But the problem is that teenagers naturally are hyper alert at night. It's normal when you're an adolescent to have a delayed circadian rhythm. the majority of adolescents have inadequate sleep duration, especially on school days, because they're alert at night, they want to go to bed late, their melatonin release is in fact delayed, and they have to get up really early in the morning to start school, say at 8:30. So there's some countries where high schools start an hour or two later, and that in fact has really improved things for adolescents. So unfortunately, having sleep deprivation affects your memory, and adolescents who go to bed late have worse school performances. But often it's tough for them because they simply cannot fall asleep earlier. Now, we know that sleep disturbances in ADHD cause too little sleep, sleep restriction, and fragmented sleep, poor quality sleep. And together, these cause excessive tiredness during the day. In fact, daytime sleepiness affects up to a third of the US workforce, and for adolescents and adults with ADHD, daytime somnolence or tiredness is in fact their most prevalent complaint in up to 42% of them. When you're tired during the day, you can be irritable, you can be moody, you concentrate even less, and it can impact your physical health too. So your work function will definitely be affected by daytime sleepiness. It's critical for your work performance and for your quality of life, your relationships too. Furthermore, when you have disrupted and disordered sleep through all these sleep disorders that go hand in hand with ADHD, you're not going to be vigilant. So your ability to detect errors untreated, your ability to be accurate and to prevent risks will be reduced. But also your physical functioning, psychomotor function like driving, manual dexterity. If you're working in a hospital as an intern or trainee doctor, most injuries where people prick themselves with needles in fact happen after 11 p.m. It relates to that dip that I was referring to earlier. The early hours of the morning are a time for errors. You also have slower response time. So if there's a disaster happening, you're going to be delayed in your response because of poor sleep. And your ability to reason logically is unfortunately also affected. And this varies throughout the circadian period, but it's lowest at 5 in the morning, your ability to reason logically. Now here's a work meeting. Everyone's sitting with little cubes, and the person with ADHD that's untreated and unrecognized works in with little balls. So people make errors. And as I said to you earlier, working shift work, if you're an intern, you're more likely with sleep deprivation to make serious diagnostic and medication errors. So again, a little question to you is, do employees with ADHD that is untreated, do you think they recognize their errors?
Yeah.
Let's see what people say in the chat.
In the meanwhile, I can tell you I do coach several operators, let's say in an oil company, an oil deconstruction fabric plant, and they do recognize their errors, and at least they also fight sleep, and because they work in shifts, you know, in the big plants.
So what would their responsibilities be, being an operator on an oil plant?
An operator is watching a screen and preventing explosions, to say it, preventing troubles in the plant.
Wow, okay. But you're saying that they do recognize their vulnerability, and they also work in shifts.
Yeah, okay. They work in shifts, and so that's for sleep. That's always, well, at least you have to be alert. It can cause indeed problems. Yeah, I know.
Right.
I think the common response so far has been yes and no, or definitely retrospectively. But some people say, but I think the consensus is that people with ADHD do recognize the errors at work, but it's often after a little rest or after a little break from that task that you're able to recognize the errors.
So having a bit of distance and looking back and assessing. But in the moment, maybe it's difficult. And absolutely, that's exactly what's been shown by research, that people who are sleep deprived underestimate the risk for errors and accidents, which in a way makes it more dangerous in the moment. But of course, in retrospect, one can perhaps see that there was a problem. Now we come to a part of the talk which I think is really interesting, and that's about memory. Now we know that one of the most important functions of sleep is in fact to help us consolidate and lay down memory. So sleep consolidates our encoded memories, and this is both the kind of memory that's based on fact, but also an implicit memory, which would be a performance or a skill. So if your sleep is very disordered, you will be less likely to draw on your memory and answer correctly in a test, for example, or to perform some complex physical action. Now we know that in people with ADHD, when we check their brain waves during sleep, we see that there's changes in the REM stage, which is the dreaming stage. However, the findings are somewhat mixed, but REM sleep is critical for learning, for consolidating your memory, for strengthening memories through associating those memories with emotions, and also critically for regulation of mood. Now, these are all areas that are problematic in untreated ADHD. So there's one school of thought that believes that if you have an ADHD that is untreated with a sleep disorder, you are less likely to be able to use your REM sleep to gain insight into a complex problem. We know from the scientific literature that there are many anecdotal reports of people, great scientists, who have had pivotal breakthroughs and insights while dreaming or during their sleep. For example, Mendeleev, who presented the periodic table of the elements, he was struggling to represent the elements in a kind of pictorial manner. And he reported that his understanding of this rule of the periodic table in fact emerged from a dream. I saw in a dream a table where all the elements fell into place as required. Awakening, I immediately wrote it down on a piece of paper. So he got his insight from his dream. Then we have Kekule, who dreamt the chemical structure of benzene. For the chemists among us, it's got 6 carbons and 6 hydrogens. He dreamt of a snake swallowing its tail. And from that dream, he was able to imagine for the first time from his dream the ring structure of benzene. So that these snakes, and then we come to Watson and Crick, who famously together described the double helix of the DNA molecule. Watson, who was the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, stumbled on this double helix image through a dream, again, of a spiral staircase. So dreams seem to afford us insights. This is an interesting study from Nature, where people were trained with a brand new task. They had to perform in this new task. In the task, improvement occurs very slowly, but there is a hidden insight. There is a way to succeed and to do very well at the task. After they'd been trained, so the participants in the study all got the same training, but after their training, they were randomly assigned to one of 3 groups. Sleeping for 8 hours at night, kept awake the whole night, or simply being awake during the day and then sleeping at night. The people who slept after they were trained more than doubled the probability of gaining insight into this hidden rule compared to the people who were kept awake. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that having good quality sleep improves our chances of seeing the hidden insights in a problem and being able to problem solve. And therefore, sleepy workers or sleep-deprived workers may be at a disadvantage in gaining insight. And here we have the study from Nature at the top. Really interesting, I think. So let's look at circadian rhythms. Electric light was invented 130 years ago, and we now live in a society which is 24/7. In ADHD, the most common sleep disorder is in fact a delayed circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is this 24-hour, about a day rhythm. It's regulated by a tiny clock that sits in our brain in the suprachiasmatic nuclei. In the general population, the evening chronotype, or those people who are more alert and awake at night, occur in about 25% of people. But some people have this extreme situation where they have what's called delayed sleep phase syndrome. And that's only about 3% of the population, in the general population, where they cannot fall asleep before 1 or 2 a.m. Even if they lie down in bed, they simply cannot fall asleep, and they would like to sleep late in the morning. In people with ADHD, this delayed sleep phase syndrome is present in up to 78%. So it is very common for adults with ADHD to have a delayed rhythm. Now, we can measure this, in fact, from the saliva. There's a hormone that is released by the brain, which tells us to fall asleep, called melatonin. And we can measure the amount of melatonin in the saliva by getting people to chew on a little cotton wool swab. Where melatonin is released, that's what we call dim light melatonin onset. That is the signal when things get dark and we don't have artificial light around us. Our brains produce melatonin, and within an hour to an hour and a half, we're really sleepy and we fall asleep. We know that for adults with ADHD, this melatonin onset, the release of melatonin into the blood circulation, is delayed by about an hour and a half. And there seems to be some genetic association between having ADHD and having a delayed circadian rhythm. The same genes, the clock genes, seem to be involved in both. Adults with insufficient sleep are more likely to report ADHD symptoms, and it's a relationship that works in both ways. It's complex, it's bidirectional. There seems to be an interplay between your rhythm and how alert or aroused you are. And in fact, the similar neurotransmitter or chemical messenger systems are involved in both ADHD and sleep. In the eye, dopamine, the alertness and concentration neurotransmitters, in fact, released during the day. It keeps us awake. And dopamine inhibits melatonin secretion. So this is really interesting, the kind of overlap between sleep, perception of light, and alertness. What happens if your circadian rhythm is disrupted? Well, here are the health effects. Your sleep will be bad. You're more likely to have obesity and diabetes. If you awake at 2 in the morning, you might get hungry. If you eat at that time, your body is not primed to digest then. So that might lead you to having some metabolic problems and perhaps gaining weight. Or if in the day you're incredibly tired because you've got a delayed rhythm, you're going to eat carbohydrate-rich and sugary foods to give you that energy boost to keep awake. So we know that people with ADHD frequently untreated, have obesity, depression, heart disease, even cancer. We know that shift working is related to disturbed melatonin release, and in fact has been linked to the development of cancer. It also affects your immunity. So here's a good article on the health consequences of electric lighting and how that affects our health. So let me talk to you about, I've mentioned them just briefly, but some medical illnesses that are in fact comorbid in ADHD. I said to you already that you wouldn't think intuitively that people with ADHD who perhaps hyperactive would be obese. But in fact, in 70% of adults with ADHD, the BMI was increased, and in children in 40%. So both for children and adults, there's a risk of obesity. Severe obesity can lead to breathing problems during sleep in ADHD. Asthma is also associated with ADHD, and so is migraine. So when you have these medical problems coexisting, you're more likely to have them if you have ADHD, and then you're more likely to be sick and off sick from work. And that has been shown in studies. The relative odds of being off sick is twice as high for people with ADHD that is untreated. Or having an accident at work is twice as high. And your work performance will be reduced in up to 4 or 5% because of these medical problems. So coming to the medications, we've touched on this earlier, in fact, but interestingly, I'm just going to recap for you quickly. Stimulant treatments might, in fact, be associated with causing, for example, insomnia, but as I said to you earlier, they can sometimes improve sleep by quieting the brain at night and allowing people to fall asleep calmly. I want to mention a sixth factor that's important in poor sleep and ADHD affecting work performance, and that's the ability to regulate yourself. Okay, so self-regulation and ADHD at work. What is self-regulation? It's the ability to control your behavior in an effortful way, to adjust your response to a particular situation, and it allows for a socially desirable response and a positive outcome. Sleep disorder, sleep deprivation is linked to hostility, to negative affect or depression, less good humor, grumpiness, let's say, poor tolerance for stress, and fluctuating emotions, emotional lability. We know that in ADHD, one of the core features, although it's not in the DSM, but poor self-regulation, that's something that we see very often, and it can cause a lot of problems in relationships. Now, both executive function and interpersonal communication are important in self-regulation at the workplace. If you have problems with executive function because you have an untreated ADHD, you're more likely to make careless mistakes, you struggle to plan for the time you have a big workload, you can't multitask, you will not be sufficiently productive. But if you have difficulties with your interpersonal communication, then you might be very impulsive in a relationship to say what's on the top of your head, interrupt people perhaps, struggle to listen in meetings, be defensive when you're criticized, or have anger outbursts, irritability or hostility. So these are both critical for self-regulation, and they're both critical in untreated ADHD. Now, having a good time at work means that your relationships with your colleagues are good. And it's debilitatingly difficult for people who have untreated ADHD to function socially because of their impulsivity and their inattention. This can cost a lot to the employer, and it can create strain or even conflict in a team. These days, many businesses have zero tolerance policies towards anger outbursts. Now, we know that people with ADHD should not be discriminated against in the workplace legally, but on the work floor, it's sometimes different. For some people with untreated ADHD, this might be a greater problem than just simply the classical symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, or impulsivity. Right, we've now come to what women with ADHD experience at work. Perhaps
before you proceed,
yes.
Just to keep us a bit focused.
Sure.
If I listen with a certain mind, I would say, let's say when I'm an employer, I don't know too much about ADHD, and I listen to what you're telling. Then certainly with the last picture you showed, the last dia, I would say, okay, never hire a person with ADHD. I think that's not your intention, but financial costs and making mistakes and no communication. Okay, that's everything we need here at work. So can you maybe make a sort of nuance? What if an employer is listening in, what would we say to an employer at the moment?
I would say to an employer, be patient, because if you wait till the last part of the talk, you will hear the enormous riches that someone with untreated ADHD can bring to your team. So in fact, you would be losing someone who is creative and bubbly and charismatic, who thinks out of the box. Okay. So people with ADHD have a lot to contribute, and they should be supported. So if you have to do tons of administration or chair terribly long and boring meetings, that will not be using the ADHD person to his or her best capacity. But if this person can choose his or her own schedule, there's a lot of interaction, the job profile changes during the day, like in sales or creative jobs, with adequate administrative support, you will have a diamond in your workforce.
Yeah, right. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Okay. So maybe just from the chat, to come back to my question, I'm interested if there are women among us listening in, or people who would like to comment, what are the issues particular to women? Because I think unfortunately often women are neglected in the research of ADHD. There's a lot that we need to understand about women with ADHD, and we're just beginning to. But have people written anything in the chat, Viljo, in answer to this question?
Not yet, but give them a couple of seconds and.
Sure. Yeah.
I am watching and waiting.
This is something that ADHD Europe is actually quite involved in. There is a subgroup of women with ADHD, so trying to focus attention on the particular stresses and strains as well as gifts of women with ADHD.
Well,
so I'm seeing impulsivity, hormonal changes, obviously the difference that women have more to juggle in terms of, and there's societal issues where men with energy, ideas, and impulsivity can still move up, but for women that's seen as more of a negative sometimes.
Sure.
Certainly very true.
Great points.
Lack of support prior to diagnosis, and more demands on multitasking.
Fantastic. Yep. Fantastic answers, because actually that's the kernel of what I wanted to say. And I like the fact that someone referred to hormonal changes, because that's the work of Sandra Coy, who has given a talk on ADHD Europe. For those of you who haven't seen it, I recommend it. But it's very interesting work looking at hormonal rhythms and ADHD in women. But absolutely, girls and women with ADHD are more likely to be undiagnosed or misdiagnosed as something else. And the question is why? Because traditionally, ADHD was thought as a condition affecting boys and men, but also because the way women present is less obvious. Now, this can be a major disadvantage because treatment with ADHD medication really helps one's educational outcome and one's job performance. So if you're not going to be diagnosed simply because you're a woman, you're at even more of a disadvantage. Misdiagnosis is a big problem with ADHD in general, but perhaps more so with women, because if there is this emotional lability that I described, it might be misdiagnosed as depression or even a personality disorder such as borderline. I must also mention that the two do coexist, so it's possible to have both. But there's some conditions that improve actually once ADHD is treated. Someone mentioned juggling in the answers, and that's 100% correct. We call it role strain. So women are more likely, because of sexism, to have the bulk of responsibility for the household, for parenting, and caring for the elderly, caring for animals. These are borne by women. And this is because, as I said, of a social inequality and a cultural inequality that's taking a long time to come right. But with ADHD, this is a real problem because you have a bigger load, you have more balls in the air to juggle, and therefore having ADHD makes it particularly difficult. There's there's more impairment and more anxiety in these women compared to men with ADHD. Right at the beginning of the talk, Hans spoke about self-esteem being low, and that's particularly true in mothers with ADHD, more so than in fathers. What about, so ADHD and these multiple roles and work responsibilities are an issue because women who have ADHD are more likely to be disorganized or forgetful or inattentive at work. They might, from research, have more difficulty accepting constructive criticism and managing their interpersonal relationships. Someone mentioned hormonal issues. We know that untreated ADHD in teens gives rise at times to unplanned pregnancies. There might be increased symptoms of ADHD or irritability also related to the menstrual cycle. Or for women who return to work after they've had children, it might be an enormous challenge for a young woman with ADHD. And also they might end up with a so-called burnout. So when you're inattentive, it takes continuous mental effort, which is exhausting. Women might present with multiple burnouts and complain of chronic exhaustion. And in fact, there's an interesting link that has been shown through research between chronic fatigue syndrome and ADHD in women. Chronic fatigue syndrome is 4 times as common in people with ADHD. And in the subgroup of people with chronic fatigue who have ADHD, if they're given methylphenidate in this particular study, their tiredness and inattention improved. So, these difficulties may persist despite having great work ethic. Untreated ADHD may lead to persisting problems. Even if you're immensely intelligent or you have great motivation, you might have difficulties at work. And if you fail at work, you don't feel good about yourself. You're discouraged, you feel guilty. It's the cycle of failure, despair, and demoralization, which we really must challenge. We need to challenge this. So the last part of my talk, we're just reaching the end of our time, is what are the advantages of ADHD at work? I've mentioned a few of them. Let's see what people jot down in the chat.
Yeah.
Ready and waiting to read out your comments.
Great. It can even just be words.
So while people are thinking and replying, you mentioned a whole list of, let's say, symptoms or troubles depending happening at work. A lot due to sleep deprivation, etc. I think that your message is, hey, if you get a diagnosis, you can be treated for a lot of the negative sides. So that's the time we go to then the positive sides, the qualities, etc. So do I summarize your intention in the right way?
Absolutely. And I would say don't lose the positive sides. When we talk about treatment, some people choose not to take treatment for particular work functions, like coming up with amazing ideas. They might brainstorm and have more creativity off medication. So I've had patients who at times tailored their medication according to the demands of the workplace because their ADHD conferred such advantage for certain tasks that they preferred to do those tasks without medication. But let's return to the audience and see what people think.
Absolutely. So one of the first things to come up was creativity, thinking outside the box, ability to hyper-focus and solve problems, different ways of thinking, brainstorming. Creativity, again, is a very common one, and it's one I certainly agree with myself. Being able to make connections which aren't immediately obvious, enthusiasm and putting effort into the job. There's a lot of good, positive things in the chat here. General curiosity as well.
Absolutely. Curiosity. Curiosity is so important. Asking questions. It's the first step to knowledge and to finding solutions. So you're right. Some absolutely you again. It's interesting when I ask the questions to the audience has the answers. I'm just kind of showing you pictures, but you basically know it. Some aspects of ADHD are impairing in one environment, but in fact can be positive in another, as long as you channel it correctly. So this incredible energy, if you're sitting in a 6-hour meeting without moving, that might be a problem. But if you're during a site visit, that relentless energy will leave everyone else panting, and you'll be streaks ahead. So that's an example. Broad attention and distractibility, in fact, in research, have been shown to enhance creative thinking. So it's not just what we say, but it's in fact been shown scientifically through the research. Amongst highly creative children, 40% had ADHD symptomatology. When you've had a lifetime of ADHD, you've developed a lot of resilience. And that is so precious in the workplace. Resilient people can be extremely helpful at work. Other advantages are multitasking, having this extra energy. So choose a job that's busy and fast-paced and changes with variety. Use these symptoms positively, like high energy levels in a physically demanding job can be fantastic. Some people who are self-employed and therefore can structure their days say that they would be unable to work at all without this inner restlessness that they have. It pushes them to achieve more and to reach their goals. I can bounce around a lot at my job. So individuals with ADHD are well suited to creative and spontaneous jobs where they can shine. Someone mentioned hyper-focusing on things, and that can definitely be an advantage of ADHD. So can the willingness to take risks. Sometimes it's good to take a risk, actually, because you might get something extraordinary as a result. They're spontaneous, they're flexible, they think outside the box. Often people with ADHD are very good in a crisis. They're optimistic and cheerful. And they tend to work in sprints rather than marathons. So it's good to find a job where there's short-term deadlines where you can pace yourself and not have to slog it out necessarily for 25 years before you hand in what you need to hand in. So we've just gone a little bit over time, but I'd like to draw some conclusions and then we can throw this open to discussion. Yes, ADHD confers some definite advantages at work. Untreated ADHD, I mean. It can be a disadvantage in certain settings. Sleep disorders are often coexisting with ADHD and they can impair performance. So we need to be aware of sleep problems in work and how they impact on work. It's particularly challenging for people with untreated ADHD to regulate themselves, and this can be an issue in relationships at work. Untreated ADHD and sleep problems are going to affect people's ability to gain work, to maintain their jobs, to work safely and productively. However, ADHD is treatable. So together, and I hope there's some healthcare workers amongst us, let's ensure optimal occupational health. Thank you for your attention this evening. This is the team of people that I worked with in conducting my research. I'd like to thank them, and I'd also like to thank the artists who contributed a lot of these beautiful images. And now I'm going to open for general discussions. I had more ideas before breakfast than you had all week. So let's hear what people think and what they'd like to ask.
Yeah. While people are putting questions in the comments, I would like to share two pictures with you. One about these positive and negative aspects. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Association for ADHD and Dyslexia, etc., did a small survey on what do people themselves who have ADHD mention as positive and as negative traits of ADHD. Can I share, Viljo?
Oh, my microphone's off. Yeah, go ahead, Hans. And I can
share screen, and then share whole screen, doesn't it?
Yeah, share whole screen.
Share screen easiest to work. Okay, it doesn't work.
Technical difficulties here. Hans, do you want to just send me the things and I'll pull them up? Oh, no, here we go. I can see something.
Here we go. Okay. Can you see this?
Let's see. No, we got a black screen.
Black screen. Okay, then. Well, I will mention them. Never mind.
You can paint a picture with words.
Yeah, I can paint the picture with words. We asked in the Netherlands, people with ADHD mentioned the negative aspects. It's they said dreamy waves through big thoughts, distracted, quickly overexcited, mood changes, like you mentioned, difficulty taking action, poor short-term memory, delayed response, etc., etc., coming late, word finding, little patience. So very much the same as you were mentioning, maybe in some other words. What's at the moment more important? They mentioned as positive qualities, positive aspects of ADHD, sense of humor, associative thinking, analytically strong, sees the big picture, not into details, but sees the big picture, empathic, strong in foreign languages, sharp and fast in crisis and emergency situations, strong long-term memory, broad interest, always have energy to solve problems, taking good action, troubleshooting, thinking about everyone and everything, less inhibited, so thinking outside the box, creativity, innovation and exploration, enthusiastic, hyper-focus and perseverance. So it sounds a lot like what you've been telling us. This is what the people themselves experience or have heard and can confirm. So it's important to have these. When I could have shown you, it's through the same list. They are even long. So anyways, in the meanwhile, I hope we have some questions there. I remember one question. Should people come out, come out to your employer? Tell your employer I have ADHD.
Okay, I can't go that far back up in the chat. The question was specifically about, when is the right time to tell your employer that you have ADHD?
Yeah.
I think it's a very interesting and a very good question, because I think very much it depends on the situation. If you're in the UK, it would be illegal for your employer at any point to discriminate against you. So therefore, from the first minute, while you're applying for the job, you should and could say so, because if you were discriminated against, that would be illegal. So the answer to that is immediately. However, there may be countries in Europe where it's not yet recognized to the same extent. And then I think people have to weigh up quite carefully how they would put it across. But I hope that people with ADHD are also aware of all the immense strengths and qualities that they can contribute to a team, and therefore also be educated enough to communicate that too. To select a job where, in fact, if possible, their strengths come to the fore. What do you think on this, Hans? What is your advice to people?
Yeah, when you apply for a job, most of the time I advise them not to really mention at once the ADHD, because, employers, if they have prejudice about it, they will not tell you, I won't hire you because of ADHD. They just say, well, we found someone else who has just a bit more experience, and then negative. So I advise them to be open about their positive and negative sides. A good job interview goes into what are your strong sides and what are your weaknesses. And that's your opportunity to at least mention some things like, well, meetings longer than 1.5 hours, that's too much for me. And sometimes I work better in a concentration room. So then you have already mentioned that. And on the other hand, if there is a big challenge or a crisis in the company, you can call me and I will help you. Let's say in a conversation, you can bring it up in a smooth way, not summing it up, but just talking about it. And I train them to bring it up. But the word ADHD in a job interview in the Netherlands, at some places, but the rest of Europe, I don't know for England, but if you bring up I have ADHD, it depends on if you do it from a victim attitude. Maybe you can elaborate about that, Dora. If you're still feel sorry for yourself, oh, it's so terrible, and I have ADHD, and then I have this sleep disorder, and my mother was also. If you sense that kind of victimizing yourself, then better not bring it up.
Sure.
I think also it's. Oh, sorry, go on, Dora.
No, you go ahead, Phil. I think it's important to hear from you.
Well, I was just going to say that even though in the UK it is illegal to discriminate against someone because of their disability, it can be very difficult, as both you and Hans mentioned, to prove that discrimination is because of their disability and not just, oh, we found someone else. But once you have got a job and once you can mention, this is my disability, these are my needs for reasonable adjustment, employers have a responsibility to make those adjustments. And from the UK specifically, I believe there's a scheme called Disability Confident Employers, where if you meet the requirements on paper to achieve a job and you want to declare your disability, the employer guarantees that you will receive an interview and that they will make the necessary reasonable adjustments. And so they've been accredited to that standard. So that's something to look for if you're looking for an employer who might understand ADHD better. But again, it's important to know your rights, and it's important to get the right support from a legal perspective from, in the UK, ACAS or a trade union, for example, because that's better than the general advice we can give.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I mean, I think a lot of it is about psychoeducation. So understanding your condition yourself, knowing what your strengths are, knowing what your difficulties are, and being honest and direct, but a little bit careful, not expecting the world to be as advanced as because unfortunately it is a fairly new condition. And I can say that there are many psychiatrists who were not taught anything about ADHD, 5 years ago in adults. So if psychiatrists are not familiar with this condition, how can we expect people who run businesses to be aware of it?
Yeah,
we need to have, and unfortunately, psychoeducation has to go really broadly so that people are aware of what this condition is. And most of all, be an expert on your own condition. Know your own strengths, know your weaknesses, and present those in a balanced way.
And to stretch that a little bit further, if I'm an employer myself since 1990 or something, and if I meet a new employee, I would listen to what you say. If you tell me I've had a burnout 2 years ago and now it appears that I have ADHD, from that moment on, I will listen. Did you process it for yourself? Do you understand yourself? Did you evaluate? Did you evolve? Did you develop yourself? Are you sadder but wiser? Did you? And then I would hire you because you are someone with a rich experience. You know how to challenge a problem. But if you're still in the problem, then sorry, I would doubt about hiring you. You understand what I mean? That's just a difference.
It's about the employer's perspective. Yeah,
from the employer. That's what we're talking about. If an employer would hire you.
But if they can understand it in their perspective, how it can be beneficial, it depends as much about their hiring process as anything else. How thorough and how well developed their hiring process is going to help you to explain the strengths that your ADHD has. And if they can't pick up on that, it might not just be because your ADHD is the problem. It might also be because their hiring processes aren't looking for the right things. Yeah,
and by the way, at least in the Netherlands, I know we are proceeding. Let's not be prejudiced against employers, because some employers are really wise. In fact, in the Netherlands, employers are now asking people with autism to apply for a certain job, let's say in IT. And for ADHD, the same. And I was coaching, that is already some 5 years ago, an account manager who has dyslexia and ADHD. And when he went on for another job, his employer phoned me, Hans, do you know anybody else with dyslexia and ADHD? We want to hire them. So step by step, employers are also have a family nephew or something with ADHD, you know, so it takes time. Don't stay in your prejudice against employers. Be open.
Sure. Absolutely. That is so heartening. It's wonderful.
Absolutely.
Being able to scan an environment, being able to pick up slight changes in a list of numbers. I mean, people with certain autistic traits would be extremely good at that, you know. Similarly with ADHD, being aware of all the stimuli around you, being able to scan or at times hyper-focus. Both of those would be very useful characteristics.
Absolutely.
And I think, as you said, Hans, it's important that, you know, lots of employers are recognizing these benefits and they are learning where people with certain conditions can be beneficial. And there are some that aren't, but you have the legal rights and you have people to support you where you have difficulties. I just want to pick up on one thing that someone mentioned, which is that in the UK, if you do have a job, there's a program called Access to Work where you can apply for additional support, and they can make suggestions like providing ADHD coaching and job coaching. They can provide noise cancelling headphones if you struggle with distraction from noisy environment, and barriers for your desk to make sure that you're able to have a quiet, comfortable space. So, you know, it depends in different countries in Europe, and obviously I can only really speak to the UK perspective, but there is support out there for making people with ADHD able to engage with their jobs and be successful.
Yeah. By the way, I see our friend in Luxembourg, Alexia. She says the fact that there are 6 times more ADHD people in entrepreneur population just says it all. The workplace is mostly ADHD unfriendly. So that's positive on the side of entrepreneurship, but negative on workplaces. And in fact, in a lot of workplaces, it is like that. What's your experience, Dora, with unfriendly workplaces of your patients, clients, and entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I think that there are quite a few sort of very famous, world famous entrepreneurs who've openly said that they've got ADHD and who've done exceptionally well. So I think those are sort of the stars, the very bright stars in the galaxy. But I think in general, it's true that people with ADHD might be more willing to take risks. They're often very creative, they're charismatic, they have incredible energy. And they perhaps are at times better suited to be working on their own, creating something themselves, rather than trying to shift themselves into this very tight mold and, you know, be something that they're not. On the other hand, they do have something to contribute to the workplace, and I hope that there will be equal opportunities for people with ADHD. So they're not forced into one area, but if they wish to work in a structured work environment, there will be opportunities for them there.
Yeah, I know, but I'm a bit two minds about this, what Alexia says. The workplace is mostly ADHD unfriendly. I would like I will be talking about this with her later on, but don't turn it around. If you are meant to be an entrepreneur, then like you say, to put yourself in this narrow, structured box, it might work, but maybe you could go for where your soul wants to go, and that's take risks. And I myself, I've been working in court, in the Rotterdam Court of Justice. That's super structured. Everything is in the law, you know. So it's not. I ended up with burnout and anxiety disorder, etc. And in the end, I flew out and worked on university, and then my own company, etc. So it wasn't all bad in court in this super structured environment, but now I know by the time I am this age, I would have been a nasty old man, a grumpy old man who only gives everybody the blame, and now I'm more happy. And so be careful. Some workplaces are unfriendly indeed, but please keep the nuance there.
Sure. I think it also depends on the structure that is offered. I think these days in the workplace, people are expected to cut costs. People are expected to do more and more of their own administration. I'm just thinking within the hospital situation that I'm working in, there's no such thing as someone who's doing secretarial work. It's sort of this anonymous email that you send to. So people with ADHD will really benefit where there is structure. That can actually sometimes be quite good if there's a sort of external structure, as long as where they're boring, repetitive, tedious, administrative tasks, they're getting enough support.
Yeah.
Do we have some other comments or questions in the chat?
We have quite a few actually. One of the ones I think that's just come up is quite interesting. Are people successful because or despite of their ADHD?
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I think both are true. I think that some people are successful simply because they have ADHD, and without it, they would have not achieved what they achieve. It's given them that edge. The sort of neurodiversity has given them a way to view the world and be creative in a different kind of way. Some people, who are sitting in the Rotterdam court, it would be a huge strain to be on time, to prepare your heads of argument, to remember to wear the correct gear. So that would be despite. That would mean where they're not being treated, they have to put so much more effort in to get to where they need to be. And that would then be a case of despite. And actually, congratulations to them for succeeding, because it takes so much more effort to get there.
Yeah. Sure.
So it could be both. Yeah.
Absolutely.
By the way, scientists in the Netherlands are now trying to really create evidence for all these positive traits in ADHD. Everybody knows it. Everybody who's into ADHD knows it. But now they are working as an initiative of the Dutch Association for People with ADHD. The Radboud University in Nijmegen is doing research into the qualities and positive aspects of ADHD. But it's a challenge because imagine trying to prove creativity in a person. What kind of computer or microscope do you need then? So It's quite a challenge, but they're working on it, and that will help, of course.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing that I need to say, is that a lot of these positive attributes have not been rigorously studied enough. Often people who are highly successful with their ADHD do not present for studies or do not come to get help, or are not viewed as patients. So that makes it a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, that's a pity. It's also depending on money, because you get money for people who are ill and have symptoms and have psychiatric diagnosis, etc. That's where money goes to. But getting money to prove positive qualities, that's
our funding model isn't really looking for, this is a great thing. It's looking for how can we treat this and improve this.
Yeah.
So
sure.
that is a challenge, I'm sure. I think. Here's a great question. Thank you, Hugh. What about ADHD people as managers? It's been hard on his team sometimes. I'm interested to know. I mean, my manager has ADHD. I know a lot of people who are managers and have ADHD, and it'd be interesting to hear your perspectives on this, Hans and Dora.
Dora, you first.
Yeah, I think that it can be absolutely wonderful to have a manager with ADHD, because that person is always optimistic, is positive, has a lot of energy, is inspiring to the team, might do spontaneous things like have a meeting on the beach, or, So I think that it can be it can be wonderful if that manager knows him or herself well and can delegate out those parts of the job that are really difficult. I think there's more chance of being successful. But there is the risk, if it's, again, untreated, that the manager might sort of say tactless things or say things in a way that are not meant to be offensive but could be construed that way. So, perhaps struggle to listen at times and hear the other person's perspective. That could be difficult, or perhaps talk excessively, because sometimes people who are hyperactive in their ADHD don't give others a chance to talk. That can be, if you're extremely shy, it can be great to have a manager who does all the talking. But if you have an opinion, that might be quite challenging to be with. But people in teams can devise ways of letting each other know when certain behaviors become a little bit uncomfortable and giving each other space. These are all things that can be learned. Yeah. What do you think, Hans, about managers?
Yeah, I sure have a lot of experience with that. In general, when someone asks me, being a manager or having ADHD, wanting to be a manager, I advise you may be a very good leader, leading the group, inspiring the group, but not a good manager for doing it for 10 years on the same basis, in the same structure. That's one general advice. More a leader than a manager in the way of defined as managing things that that are running in the business. Let me come out about myself. I had an IT company, and sorry to say so, in a way I was a terrible employer, because when one of my employees had a chat with me, it was fantastic. He sort of loved me. He was talking about, can I get a salary raise and how you do? And then I said to him, well, I will talk to the business partner and then I'll come back to you. Hans didn't come back to it. Even worse, 3 weeks later, he was waiting for this answer. And in our next meeting, he asked us, and did you talk about? And then he sees in my face, I have no clue what he's talking about because of my forgetfulness. I really didn't remember that and now that he mentioned it, I remembered it again. But this is really an offense against your employee. So I myself, I'm not a manager, but some are. And especially, I know he is a bit famous in the Netherlands, Remco Idema. He's a Dutch interim manager. And he also applies to the example you gave. Some use their medication at will when it's necessary. Remco says, as he is an interim manager at a local government. So that's quite structured work most of the time. But he goes to a department when the manager is gone or is fired or something and there's a crisis. He goes in as an interim manager. Then the first 6 months, no medication, very exciting, solving all the problems, talking with all the people. And then after 6 months, he says, if I have to stay in that department and lead them a bit more until the next manager comes in, I do use my Ritalin or whatever he uses. So when it's exciting and a sort of crisis manager, interim manager, okay for ADHD, even without medication in some. But when it's getting a day-to-day job and the next day is the same day as yesterday, then at least you need medication to keep up appearances to get through.
But Hans, that's a fantastic distinction between being a leader and being a manager of the boring, repetitive tasks. I like that. But also what's so interesting is self-awareness and self-knowledge. You recognized your weaknesses as a manager. And I think that just makes for a richer work experience where people can reflect and know what their own limitations are. That makes for a healthier work environment. Yeah.
And most of the time you can deal with it because we were two entrepreneurs and I did the personnel. So then I stopped with personnel. I was the one, my business partner took over the personnel management and I went outside to the customers implementation of IT, etc. Very exciting. Talking to the mayor of the city, etc. And like the charisma, etc. That's my thing, you know. So you don't have to be able to do everything.
Great point. Yeah, I agree with that. Delegating
Absolutely.
and separating roles.
Yeah, sure.
And only taking on board what you can do, I think, as well. I think if you're in a management position and you have a team to look after and you have work that needs to be done, being able to prioritize, something I've learned myself, it is really very important, both for yourself and your ability to fight burnout and get your work done, but also for the team that rely on you to be there for their needs.
Yep, sure. Well, I think it's time to round up. And anything to bring up from your side, Viljo? Last round.
No, I think we've covered a really, really interesting range of topics. Thank you, Dora, and thank you, Hans.
Yeah. My conclusion is there is so much to tell about ADHD at work that I hope that in one way or another way, ADHD Europe can do a follow-up in a second webinar. We will see if that will succeed. And it's Dora, I really would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation and your interactiveness. Is that an English word? Your interactiveness? I don't know, but you will understand what I mean. And what I started with, I'm so happy to talk to a psychiatrist who really has interest in people, how they work, because that is of huge importance. Please share this with all your colleague psychiatrists all over the world.
Well, hopefully people can Google broadcasting ADHD.
Yeah.
And I think they can find all the fantastic webinars that this organization puts together. So
absolutely. And if you're already on our YouTube channel, you can click the button down below to subscribe. So you'll be notified whenever we go live, whenever we've got a new webinar. And you can look through our catalogue of previous webinars as well with people like Sandra Coy, Kevin Roberts, Barbara Franke, and a bunch of other really interesting talks from scientists and researchers with ADHD.
Yep, sure. Okay, so thank you again, Dora, and good evening to everybody, and time to relax and call it a day. Tell to your brain that it may be time to go to sleep in, 1.5 hours or something, yeah?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Right.
Good night, everyone, and thank you to both of you. Thank you for hosting us.
You.
And bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.